Just introduce Sarah. So today we're really pleased to present Sarah Sutton, who'll be talking about hyperlocal garden design. And Sarah is an Ontario County Master Gardener and owner of Spicebush Swallowtail Native Plants and Ecological Garden Design. So we're really pleased to have her here. And I hope the nice weather doesn't discourage anyone from staying through to listen. So, Sarah?
Okay. Thank you, Janet, and thank you, Donna, for hosting. I'm going to minimize everyone's pictures because I find it distracting. I am Sarah Sutton. I am the owner of Spicebush Swallowtail Native Plants and Eco Garden Planning. I'm going to give you a little further of an introduction just to give you some context on me. I began my interest in native plants when I lived on 14 acres in Trumansburg. So my husband and I both had full-time jobs. We had just had a baby. And really, my inspiration initially was get rid of turf grass because it took, 6 hours on a Saturday to mow that lawn. So I became more hobby-based interested in, okay, how can I turn this former farmland into meadow? I created all these different zones. How can I make a shrub island thicket? And at that time, I had Jim Angle of White Oak Nursery come and do a site visit. And I was blown away. His knowledge and the way he could really, look at the plants and understand the history of the site. And so that hobby came a career switch in midlife where I said, okay, I had just gotten tenured. I was teaching at Ithaca College and COVID hit, and my husband and I decided to move back up to the Rochester area where we could kind of downsize. And I started working for White Oak Nursery at that point. So I worked for him for about 4 years, during which time, I almost consider it an apprenticeship. I felt I was too old to go back to college and get into more debt. But I loved just working for him and learning the kind of ins and outs of a native plant nursery. I learned things like, growing from seed, collecting seed, restoration, what to plant after someone takes the invasives out, reforestation, just the whole kind of gamut of what it's like to be, a native plant designer and to grow plants. So that was a really important experience for me. And then, moving up here, so he had started to recommend me for site visits in Monroe County. And it was a little too far for him. And I was, now pretty knowledgeable. This was about at the 3 year point. But I would do these amazing designs, but nobody could get seed grown native plants that weren't cultivars. So I really, the love for me is the growing. So I decided to, focus the most on growing the plants. Okay, so the name of my talk today is Hyperlocal Garden Design. And what does that even mean? I'm going to explain that. I'm referring to plants and design choices that are based on observable functioning ecosystems. So I'm going to talk a lot about place in this talk. So some functioning ecosystems that I either see a lot in our area, I'm going to be very specifically referring to Ecoregion 3, the Great Lakes Basin, the Lake Ontario Basin. And I'm going to tell you what that means in a minute and why it matters. But here's some functioning plant communities, ecosystems that I see locally. So we have a lot of upland forests, so oak hickory forest, beech maple forest, sometimes beech maple ash forests if they're still intact. We have a lot of wet meadows, so low-lying areas that don't drain very well. The Honeoye Inlet is just an incredible example, but these are all over our areas. They're often an edge between a forest or a shrubland and a low-lying area. We even have an oak savanna. So I don't know how many of you have been to Rush Oak openings, but it's one of my favorite places, in particular for butterfly watching. So here our dominant oak is chinkapin oak, which is fire resistant. And this land has been managed via controlled burns for thousands of years by indigenous peoples and now by the DEC. It's still control burned once a year. So that allows for this amazing clearing. We've got, all the native grasses that are common in our area, Indian grass, little and big blue stem. It is just outstanding. And then wonderful flowering forbs. We have swamps. We have lots of swamps in our area. It's actually very characteristic of our glaciation. We have Cicero Swamp in the Syracuse area, and we used to have a swamp called Lodi Swamp. Those of you from Syracuse, I'm sure, know about this. But it was a white cedar swamp, and that was, basically where downtown Syracuse is now. It was completely filled in, and now it's very urban. But the Cicero Swamp was pretty hard to develop, so now it's a managed area, and that's a red maple swamp forest and a black spruce bog. And it's currently being managed for young forest and shrubland to support the amazing American woodcock. We also have sand dunes. So this is kind of a new plant community for me, but I have recently gotten more people interested in these types of plants. Maybe they live along the lake. This example is Sandy Island State Beach Park in Oswego. Also, the Alavar grasslands are even part of our ecoregion. Okay, so what is this ecoregion, this mysterious place? Plants don't really know state boundaries. So I might just focus on New York State native and end up with a plant from Long Island. Well, that doesn't have a lot to do with where I live. So these ecoregions kind of tell a combined story of glaciation, of weather, of geology. Um, and they're really about where our plants have co-evolved in these conditions with all kinds of biota. All the mammals and insects and amphibians, they've all co-evolved together in these conditions. But again, they don't always coincide with state. So I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio. Amazingly, that is part of our ecoregion. Lake Erie and Lake Ontario offer that kind of modulating weather. They're large bodies of water. They don't freeze. So in the winter, we have, a very moderate climate. And we were just talking about this before I started the talk, but, just last week it was 21 in the Ithaca area, and our lowest frost temp was 29 in Rochester. So this gets more and more pronounced as we get these late frosts. So our combined story is the close proximity to the Great Lakes. That's really important. The fertile glaciated plains, we've got lowlands and hills, and we're bordered by higher elevation regions. We also have very high population density and intense agricultural activity. So we're a very disturbed ecoregion in terms of, what's left in terms of natural areas. So here's the New York State land use map, and you can see our ecoregion includes Buffalo, Rochester, Syracuse, and even parts of Albany. So we have these highly developed areas. But the other thing we have, which is very exciting to me, is this low-lying topography. And behind us are much higher areas. So those glacial ice sheets, they dammed up the bottom of the Finger Lakes, so that area is much higher. So those ice sheets pushed through our area and created all kinds of dramatic topography. So our average height above sea level is about 400 in this ecoregion, which is pretty low. But we have tons and tons of high points that are really tiny and not tiny, but small, relatively, and dramatic. So very high point and then a low point. So an example is a moraine. We have lots and lots of moraines through our area. In urban Rochester, there's the Pinnacle Range, which is a group of moraines that were formed by moving ice. So here we have this very developed area, But all throughout our area, and Syracuse, I feel, is the same way. We've got these areas that could not be developed. They couldn't be farmed because they're too high and inhospitable. And they could not be developed for residents or, kind of suburbia. So what happened here in the Rochester area is that there's parks and trails that are literally interwoven between houses and suburban, tracks. And that makes, in my opinion, that makes us very unique. We don't often think of this ecoregion as having important natural areas, but if you take away the scale and think about these small protected areas, we have an incredible amount of biodiversity. So not just moraines, but we also have cames. So these are much more dramatic, steeper mounds of sorted, stratified sand and gravel deposited by usually stagnant ice. A lot of times there's a glacial body of water next to it, or a wetland, or a floodplain forest. And then we also have drumlins, these rolling, more regular teardropped hills. I live on top of a drumlin here in Monroe County on Knickerbocker Hill. You see these a lot in Wayne County. You can look, from a high point and just see these gorgeous rolling hills. So because of this glacial topography, we are left with these kind of natural areas, but there's incredible reciprocity and fluidity between yards and natural areas. And I think of that as a responsibility, maybe more so than a place where you drive 20 miles to a big, protected, safe, natural area. Instead, we've got these little pockets. And I feel that, it gives us kind of more of a responsibility as individual landowners to really kind of help connect to these fragmented areas. So this is an image. I wish I could see the chat to see. I'm sure you all know what this is. But this is an area of Pittsford, a suburb, where the higher area is just full of 60s landscaping, so vinca and burning bush and barberry. And then it starts to dip down into a creek bed that was never farmed or developed. So you see masses of spring ephemerals. So here we see the edge of that, though, the vinca, and we see the bloodroot struggling here amidst the vinca. So my philosophy is that we should model our gardens after naturally occurring gardens or ecosystem types as they relate to our yard condition, but also surrounding areas. This this statistic very much worries me as a nursery owner. Up to 83% of the total number of invasive taxa in the US had a horticultural origin. So many of the plants that are now invading our natural areas were brought in ornamentally or for novelty or because we felt they could do something that our native version couldn't do. And those plants have introduced a lot of problems that, it's really hard not to see those problems when you're able to start identifying them. You see this narrative wherever you go, sadly. So I often think about what plants to sell and why. So I think about bottom up versus top down. I love the Prairie Moon catalog, like we all do. We're probably all looking at it right now as we make the transition to the warmer times. And in the same way, there's, wholesale nurseries where a more commercial nursery might get ideas in this wholesale catalog and say, oh, that's a really cool plant. But there isn't always a mention of like exactly where it's from. Certainly, Prairie Moon is a much better organization, and you will, if you look up on Bon-App the plant or link through their site, you'll understand where it's from. But they're kind of all together in this when you look at the catalog and kind of evened out in a way. So I really subscribe to looking to what's right around me. I like to go to the trails and really create inventories of what's actually there and what insects are there. Maybe you have a cool plant that's from the southeast, but maybe it's a host plant to a butterfly that doesn't even make it this far north. So, there's a lot of elements to think about when I'm picking plants for the nursery. I feel that I can't go wrong by going to natural areas and seeing what is actually there, what species of goldenrod is growing. When I go to the oak savanna sites, I often see early goldenrod and I see gray goldenrod. Those are much less common in the horticultural industry than things like showy or stiff goldenrod. So that gives me a kind of clue as to like, what's actually here and who's using it. Once we switch from thinking about ecological value versus ornament, novelty, and commodity, everything changes. I think that, thinking about the value of something is inseparable from place due to this coevolution that we need for food web support. I don't know, what the knowledge level is of the audience, but one thing that I always wish more people knew about native plants is that 90% of native insects only use native plants. So until we can photosynthesize sun, which we can't, we need those insects to transfer the energy from the plants that was received via the sun. We can't do that. So you can think about, oh, everything's eating my plants, but we need that energy transfer in order to have food, in order to have pollination. It's absolutely critical, and I believe it's as basic as that. But my goal for looking to local areas is not utopic. I don't believe my yard, for instance, can be returned to what it once was. Most sites, especially yards, are highly disturbed. My yard was farmed for 150 years before it became a housing tract in the 60s. There is not much left in my seed bank. If I let it go, it would just be invasives. But for me, the call is to look at these fragments of plant communities and to really see how they function and how I can add those plants to connect to those areas. So one thing I like to do, and yes, I am a total plant nerd, is spend time on iNaturalist, the Explore feature. And I like to look for areas that have been completely turned over and urbanized to see what kind of plant memories that I can see that kind of pop up. So these are usually not communities. They're usually a plant and maybe it pops up once and then you don't see it again, or maybe it's a kind of monoculture of a native plant, which we'll see in a minute. So here we have Syracuse, this tiny little patch right next to Reed's Jewelers. And the iNaturalist record on this from Elizabeth-8 from 23 is a northern small yellow lady slipper. And this is the picture. So a bog plant popping up in the middle of an urban area. So I'm very fascinated by this. These aren't populations that will sustain, but they really explain, in the right conditions, the land has a memory. And then here we have also in the Syracuse area, in a very residential area, Dragon's Mouth ID'd, another bog plant. And here in the Rochester area, I often find oak opening plants. There's a lot more remnants of oak openings than are officially documented. There's one near the St. John Fisher campus. This is just off the side of the 490 freeway near Fairport is a huge meadow of sand dropseed. So prairie dropseed is the very popular grass, in the horticultural industry, but it's really not found in our area. But sand dropseed is, and it's beautiful, and I've seen it in multiple places. So just a little side note of these kind of ghost plants that kind of pop up from a previous ecosystem that's no longer intact. But what about an intact ecosystem? Again, in our ecoregion, these are usually fragments, even in protected and natural areas. So this is a county park. This plant community is very similar to what you might see at Beaver Lake in the Syracuse area or Mendon Ponds. We have a mixed hardwood woodland and it's bordered by a wetland. And this again, this extreme glacial topography, these are cames here, and then again bordered by a low area. They really prevent deer pressure and also invasive pressure. This is one of the most little intact patches that I've ever seen, and it's only about 3 miles from my house. So this is obviously an inspiration for me in terms of my own yard. So we're going to look at this and really think about, why it's intact and how it's functioning. But I want you to keep in mind when I say it's a fragment, I will qualify that as it's about 1.3 miles as a loop. So each half is just over a half mile, so small. And the other areas without the extreme topography, this is at Powder Mills Park, are covered in invasives. So this is a very unique little fragment. So you got to seek these areas out. So what makes it functioning? So we have a strong sense of the vertical layers here. So top to bottom, we have a canopy overstory, and how each layer functions is really important. So about 150 feet here and taller, not, it does have an open canopy. It's not an old growth forest or a mature forest. So we've got the top layer releasing oxygen, sequestering carbon, creating nesting habitat, cooling. We kind of forget that. People used to plant big trees to cool their house. But trees, especially urban trees, can make a significant difference in the air temperature, controls light, and supports caterpillars. Our subcanopy is often younger versions of the same tree, sometimes smaller trees like Prunus serratina, wild black cherry, or hackberry. But to have a healthy woodland forest, you want to have trees that are waiting there in the wings to take over if there's a disturbance. So that signifies this is a healthy environment. And then the most exciting aspect of this area is the shrub and small tree layer. This is the layer that suffers the most from our yard invasives. It supports caterpillars, has fall berries for birds, early season blooms for native pollinators, excellent erosion control, nesting, and protection. Again, carbon sequestration. So when we see those quotes of trees don't, sequester as much carbon as a solar farm, we have to think about the entire sequestration happening in an ecosystem because those lower layers sequester a lot of carbon as well. It's not a mechanistic comparison there. This layer is really important to wildlife. So, and then we have our herbaceous and ground layers, so about 0 to 4 feet. And these improve soil health through taking up nitrogen and then releasing it upon decomposition. So the roots absorb and filter excess water, and we've got a source of seeds. And the ground layer is also full of duff, so dead plant material and stems that offer that overwintering protection. So which trees do we see here in the overstory? We have black and red oak, sugar and red maple, and American beech. So, just looking at the Lepidoptera species, we've got oak trees supporting 700 caterpillar species, sugar maple 225 species, and American beech 126, including the early hair streak, a rare species. We also have a hemlock grove. So in Eastern Hemlock Grove, so even in this small area, we have microclimates. So this is a little grove that is dramatically different. It's warmer in the winter and kind of misty, very magical. And then it's cooler in the summer. So these are really important habitats for overwintering bird species. And they also stabilize. This slope is incredibly steep here. Again, was why, it's protecting this area. And it is a highly functioning ecosystem, but not without its imminent threats. So I have ID'd Willia dalgid here. There's no treatment happening. And we're also seeing beech leaf disease. So the beech trees really sucker up in response to that. And they are not getting quite as tall as they would have without it. So not a perfect system here, but very highly functioning compared to other areas. So our shrub and small tree layer is my most exciting draw to this area. So we start with our early blooms of American hazelnut. And American hazelnut supporting 106 moth and butterfly species. There's a very large thicket of it down near the wetland area. It's a host to the polymephis moth. And then we have, of course, our very valuable October, November nuts. We have witch hazels, our latest bloomer, American witch hazel. So birds eat the seeds, but cold tolerant owlet moths, this Morrison sallow is identified there regularly. They are the pollinator of these. So they're attracted to the late blooms. They have a kind of antifreeze substance that allows them to stay active when other insects are no longer active into the fall. And they attract songbirds at a time when it's hard to find that winged protein. We have lots of northern spicebush here. Obviously, one of my favorites, given the name of my nursery. We've got the March blooms and the September kind of spicy fruit. And that spicy fruit is critical for birds. It has the highest lipid content. This is a study from a professor at RIT where they dehydrated the berries and they analyzed the fat content of native berries versus non-native berries. And you can see here, Lindera benzoin up at the top, spice bush, is the highest fat content. And then below that is arrowwood viburnum. And then kind of staggered down is some of the dogwoods. And here at the bottom, we see buckthorn, multiflora rose, honeysuckles, and rose gelder, European rose gelder, with almost no lipid content, just sugar. So they're like Skittles for the birds. They're not going to help them double their weight that they need for migration or overwintering. The spicebush is an amazing understory tree. Here you can see it, bright yellow in the fall. And then through the summer, we have the spicebush swallowtail butterfly using it as a host plant. We see these amazing caterpillars that are so intriguing. And this plant is also, as I said, a host to the spicebush swallowtail, but it's important to note that a lot of native butterflies overwinter in the pupal stage. They go into a diapause, so they're dormant, and then eventually they drop to the leaf layer. So here is, right here, you can see the chrysalis. And when it's warm enough, they emerge. So that leaf layer that we talk about when you hear people saying leave the leaves, here you see how it functions. It's critical for soil and also for overwintering. We also have American hornbeam or ironwood, a lot of examples of this here. Very important host plant, and birds eat the little nutlets and the catkins and buds. We have large service berries, so Amelanchier arborea, and these are on a different timeline than the fall berries. These berries come in June, about mid-June, and they're eaten by 35 species of birds during nesting and mating season. So, we have berries on different timelines. That's very important. We see early azalea here, so a hummingbird nectar source, and also native bees. One of my favorites is black huckleberry, and it really outlines the kind of dappled light area of the trail. It's a host to Henry's elfin and 39 other moth and butterfly species, and its fruit comes after the Juneberry. So it's really at, its ripest around July. And then we have deerberry, which is also called tall huckleberry, very important host plant. And also these kind of downward drooping flowers. These are both part of the heath species, as are a lot of the plants here, the rhododendron as well. And these are pollinated by native bees primarily through buzz pollination. They're not effectively pollinated by honeybees or generalist bees. We have sightings of the red-spotted purple and the white admiral, and these are actually the same species, but they're different based on their range. Because this is a border area, they're actually both spotted here, and they too overwinter and drop to the leaf litter. So our ground layer, we have golden ragwort, a very important early species for native bees. And we have pussy toes. So a lot of us have, including myself, I sell different host plants for this, but the most common host plant for the American painted lady that's common in our area is actually these pussy toes. We have spring ephemerals. We've got several parasitic plants. I'm going to talk about why in a minute, but this downy yellow false foxglove uses oak roots. We have beech drops, which use beech roots they don't need photosynthesis. They're actually using the nutrients from the roots. We have purple-stemmed angelica in the wet area and intermediate bellflower. We have eastern teaberry and trailing arbutus. These are both also in the heath family. We see Christmas fern in the drier areas, cinnamon and sensitive fern in the wetter areas, lots of different sedges, but one of my favorites is long-beaked sedge that's spotted here a lot. And we also have a lot of areas of decomposing wood. This slope makes it really hard to manage. Our county doesn't have a lot of resources. So why does this matter? Because dead wood has 4 times the biomass of a living tree. This is like a recycling center that is, bringing more nutrients back into the ecosystem. So all this life is jam-packed on this small amount of land. And look at this soil. If I went to someone's house and they had this soil, it's colony soil, by the way, they would say to me, okay, should I add compost? How can I amend this soil? But all of those plants are functioning and thriving with that kind of dry soil. Here's some examples of the bird IDs on Trillium Trail. So we've got, plenty of insects, plenty of birds, amazing plant diversity, a highly functioning ecosystem. So what can we learn from this and apply to our yards? We definitely can take the way that the wildlife food and blooms really rotate through the season. That's something we can apply to our yards. A lot of times we're focused on June, July, the kind of midsummer time, but there's so much more if we're working with native plants, especially shrubs that bloom very early. We have all season beauty. There's no need to clean this up. It's gorgeous at all seasons with the kind of different layers and strata. Nothing is wasted. Every inch of soil is in use. A lot of heath species, as I said, and they are adapted to low fertility soils. That's why we see a lot of those parasitic plants here. Every inch is used, every nutrient. The leaves and the duff are critical for the overwintering pupa and the soil health. And we have the classic master gardener mantra of the right plants for the right place. These plants have adapted to this site over thousands of years. If picked some beautiful plant and we're so excited because it visually looked good with these plants, it would never survive the slope and the low fertility. So these are, really adapted to this place. And there's no to low maintenance. We have microclimates such as that hemlock grove and the lower wetlands, and these create dramatic edges, so kind of different habitats in the same small 1 mile loop. So that increases biodiversity. So that habitat heterogeneity is something that we could apply to our yards. The more vertical, so we've got vertical layers, and we also have kind of left to right different types of gardens, like maybe a rain garden with a kind of shrubland garden next to it. The more species can make a living in the landscape. So we're going to look at some yards and some kind of landform types for part 2 of this talk and really kind of put into practice how we might, apply some of these ideas to our yards. So different types of landforms in our area, but these happen to also be the kind of successional layers of land. So if we let our lawn go, it would stay kind of grasses and flowering plants for about 2 to 15 years, but then we would start seeing some shrubs. And those would be up there about 3 to 15 years, and then we would start seeing some trees pop up, and then we would see bigger trees. So over the course of 100+ years, our land would want to return back to its natural state, which is really forest. But these land types also exist as edges. So, we could have a grassland that borders an upland that stays a grassland relatively naturally because the area just can't support, bigger trees. Maybe it's too wet or whatnot. So we also have shrublands that kind of border bogs where we'll have, tons of blueberry or, other vaccinium plants that kind of stay at that height because it's inhospitable to taller heights. So we're going to think of these as landforms for the yard. So when I go to a site, a yard that has an overstory, I immediately think the best type of garden for this land is a woodland garden. So a lot of times I go to yards where people are very frustrated because they want the best pollinator plants, the prairie plants. But these yards have such high ecosystem value. So embrace it if this is you. So this is a site in Penfield. And we have very high value oak and hickory overstory. We've got virtually no shrub layer, so we're going to talk about that. Surprisingly, this amazing ephemeral layer. and pretty much no summer pollen sources. So this couple had said, when we go to buy plants at the big store, there's just not a lot of options for shade plants, but there really is when we're talking about woodland native plants. So woodland garden is for yards with a canopy. Where I see this most relevant is the yards that have that mature grove of trees, but then just turf grass, right? There's so much more you can do with this for beauty and for maintenance, ease of maintenance. We also have a lot of backyards in the urban areas where there's power lines, and these are often wooded. They can easily be converted to the three layers where you have, underneath, I have, for instance, in the back of my yard, I have white pines. I've started to add shrub layers, under those trees. And then you can add your kind of lower layers, your ground layers. I also see a lot of yards that are just a sea of grass with one or two really big trees. So these can become little woodland patches or little islands. So we see these woodlands in our area in oak hickory forest, beech maple. I've talked about this. We've got heartswoods in Parrington, Camillus forest. And this category also applies to bottomland, wetter forests, swampy areas, because they too have that canopy. So if you went to a yard that was really wet, I have a lot of people talk to me about that who live in Parrington, where they just have these really low, shady yards. So that would be a good model for those types of yards. So keep in mind the hickory is such a valuable tree if you have this in your yard, hosting 200 different caterpillar species. These are some common to our area, and the leaves have a really high calcium content, so great soil builders. If you have a hickory, make sure to leave a pile of leaves that's unshredded and undisturbed because you just might be hosting some Luna moths over winter. This yard also had oaks, so as we know, the oaks support more life form than any other North American tree genus. They really shape the function of entire ecosystem. And then this yard had the surprising ephemeral layer. So in May, before the trees are completely leafed out, there was a beautiful layer for early native ground dwelling bees or solitary bees for pollinators. But this yard definitely needed a shrub layer. So what are things you might add? Flowering dogwood is a good idea. For a yard like this, also fairly dry in the high areas, dry shade. Serviceberry, multiple native versions or species of serviceberry, American witch hazel. And I'm a huge fan of sedges, especially for those of us. This yard was definitely an exception. Most of us are dealing with vinca, sweet woodruff, and all kinds of invasive ground covers. Adding, large areas of sedges really create texture. Birds eat the seed. They create habitat. So wonderful for a woodland ground layer. Some suggestions I made to this property for more summer blooms, since they didn't really have much going on. Bowman's root, northern bush honeysuckle, heart-shaped aster, blue stem goldenrod, white wood aster, and goat's beard. These are all beautiful and dramatic plants for shady yards. So here we can see, can you imagine mowing this? So not only is, adding the two other layers going to create more support for life, but it's also going to make it more beautiful and easier to maintain. So when you go to a yard like this and they want a pollinator garden, it's definitely a challenge. So that's definitely not the right kind of that kind of open meadow is not really the best match for a yard like this, but there's plenty of pollinator plants that work in a woodland setting. So one thing that I love doing is I collect plant lists from places that I visit. This is by no means exhaustive, but feel free to take a picture of this if you have a wooded shade yard. There's lots of plants that I see regularly locally. I'm not going to read them all, but. And then I also talked about, wet areas can also have the canopy and have a full three-layer setting. So here are some more plants that, I see a lot in floodplain forests or swampy areas, or even yards on the edges of these areas. Wild cucumber has become one of my favorite vines. It's a super interesting plant. You can see it here in that image. And then we also have the idea of a shrubland garden. So many yards are cleared of trees, then dotted with burning bush or, privet, these kind of non-contributor or invasives. Those happen to be invasives. So you can think about adding a shrubland garden to yards that have non-native hedgerows. They can easily be converted. Yards that have foundation shrubs, where you just have like, a couple shrubs here and there flanking your house, those are perfect areas to put in some native shrubs and to make them a little denser for habitat. Also, privacy screens also make excellent shrub islands. So where we see shrubland type gardens tend to be, in upland areas where there's kind of a transition in the land type. Again, maybe not able to support larger trees. It could just be a successional shrubland where eventually it will turn into that. Finger Lakes National Forest, a little further south, is actually managed as a shrubland. We've got the Alvar shrublands in Jefferson County, and lots of shrub fens and bog areas around in our kind of wetter low-lying areas. So the woodland garden has the three layers, but the shrubland has two. You may not have a big tree in your yard, and you can add one, but it's going to take a while. So, why not create a shrub island for habitat? So we've got excellent wildlife habitat and fruit production. I love them from a design standpoint because they create almost like a little microclimate, a room-like space that'll be full of birds. And it's such an important layer because it's the most affected by our yard invasives. So most, natural areas we go to are going to have dense thickets of honeysuckle and, all kinds of non-native shrubs. So the birds are spreading those berries, but the birds will also spread the higher quality berries that you put in your yard. So think about that reciprocity. So these are yards that I've gone to where I've recommended a shrub island garden. You can see here a honeysuckle stand. They're often kind of on the edges. Sometimes they did have dogwoods like in the 50s and 60s, and then the invasives kind of took over the whole row. I've seen that happen even in my own yard with buckthorn. And then this yard had a huge bordering row of privet, very much a challenge. So in this case, kind of removing it in patches and adding some high quality shrubs. I'm definitely an advocate of the slow approach. The last thing you want to do is burn out. You got to kind of separate it into small projects. So removing that entire circumference of privet is not a reality. However, moving patches every year and replacing them with some, American hazelnut or suckering shrubs that are really going to have a lot of benefit is a good idea for these types of gardens. So we have a problem with invasives because they have no natural predation. Nothing has really evolved to eat them. And then we get the birds eating the non-nutritious berries and spreading them. Some of them have allelopathic qualities, and we have a big mess with this. This is a restoration I've worked on for the past few years, off and on, along Arundequoit Creek. And in the surrounding higher area, I feel like it is a requirement that every house has at least 3 burning bushes. And then in the fall, you can see along the creek the bright red, and there they are. Once they were taken out along here, we saw bladdernut pop up and amazing shrubs that were kind of waiting in the wings. And I too had 3 burning bushes, flanking the house here on the side and then the other side. So I highly recommend taking these shrubs out and creating yourself a little native shrub habitat. And then here we see privet, what it does in a wild area. So everything's kind of growing at once, leafing out before native plants, and they really don't stand a chance. So some native alternatives, I'm not going to read through all of these, but in the dogwood family, we have lots of options. And they all have the very early bloom for native pollinators, and then the fall berry for birds that's so important at that time. Our native viburnums, arrowwood viburnum again was that second highest fat content of the native berries. And then nannyberry needs a little bit of a wetter area, and American cranberry bush viburnum. Beautiful. Amazing fall color. If you really can't Can't part with that burning bush red. We have high bush blueberry and fragrant sumac also have gorgeous fall color. So what does one of these gardens look like that's more formally designed? Here you can see the idea of that little microclimate. This is the Nova Scotia Botanical Garden where you kind of walk into it. It's a little cooler, there's usually a lot of songbirds, just a hub of activity. And you can take advantage of that vibe by adding, little bird baths and a seating area or little tree cookie paths. So perfect place to do that. And these are just some Habitat Island tips from Larry Weiner. And I'll try to summarize these, but you want to plant in dense masses because you're creating shelter and habitat combine with those bottom layers and design your landscape to really function like the natural one. And that's why we're really looking at how these fragments that we have around us are functioning. Some examples of plants that might be found in the kind of shrub swamp community. There's some examples here that are found at the bog path at Beaver Lake, Cicero Swamp, Black Creek Swamp on the kind of west side of Rochester, Thousand Acre Swamp in Penfield. And these plants work really well, again, for those poor draining yards that do have a canopy or at least a part canopy and low-lying areas. And lastly, in terms of a kind of landform and broad category for a plant community is the meadow grassland. So these are perfect for yards that have lots and lots of turf grass and not really a lot of other cover. And not that you can't, add a shrubland island somewhere else in your yard, but these are, really a good use of large swaths of turf grass. So they can become, the kind of sunny turf grass can become a gorgeous full pollinator meadow. We've got rain gardens under this category where, kind of low-lying areas where you want to sap up that moisture or filter the groundwater before it goes into your watershed. Also, if you've got a large swath of grass, usually it's not doing very well in the shade, but it's a great place to put a sedge meadow. Sedge meadows are pretty rare now. They used to be more common in our area, but there are fragments. And here, oak openings, the Rush site is a great example. There's another oak opening in Webster. And then wetland meadows are a great example of this type. So here we see the Rush Henrietta site a little closer. And again, as I said earlier, full of butterflies. A successful meadow typically has a large percentage of grasses. It doesn't have to be this large for a home, for a residence, but the native grasses are important for structure, support. They recycle their roots for erosion control and for keeping weeds out. So this is a perfect candidate for a open meadow or grassland garden. And this site was across from a golf course, so highly treated with chemical area. And then it drained down lower into a pond. So in this yard, to put in a meadow, a full sun meadow, is to filter the water. So not only are you adding pollinator habitat, and seeds for birds, but you're also filtering that watershed water, which is so significant. Look at some of these roots. So here we have our turf grass, which is basically, one step up from an impermeable surface, like a parking lot. And then here you have these roots that are really going to drink up that water and filter it. So how I might model a yard meadow off of, say, a plant community found at Rush Oak Openings, is to, really think about using the same plants that are found there and organizing them according to succession. So really thinking about, okay, two dominant plants in the early season, two in the mid, and two in the late. And, we have this beautiful kind of changing meadow. And meadows are amazing for those horizontal plant patterns. And they look oh, and by the way, here I used for this design little blue stem. So that's also going to give it that fall look as it starts to transition. And if you do this in your yard, you can do, one segment one year, do another segment the next year with a path in between. You can use plant plugs. Seed is a whole nother conversation. that sometime I'll have, but not enough time in this talk. It's a bit more challenging, but plant plugs or small plants can achieve that. And keep in mind that large masses of the same plant tend to look more formal, like if you're in an HOA and that matters to you. Use drifts and masses to create patterns and kind of spiked architectural plants to create focal points. And again, these meadows look amazing in the fall. Benjamin Voigt always says brown is a color too. So I love that. And I love seeing the seed heads of the grasses and the kind of spent forbs that the birds are eating the seeds. And then, with the aster all the way into November in our area. So, models for this type of garden and plants that you might consider based on what's found around here are these, wet meadow plants. So, if you were creating a rain garden meadow, these are really good plants. A little highlight for me down here is this woolgrass. It's a plant I was looking to find natively and to really understand this past year. And I ended up finding it in so many places. I couldn't like not see it anymore, but it's actually a rush and it's tall and it's got these gorgeous kind of bronzy seed heads. And it is here at the Honeoye Inlet. You can't really see it, but it's back there. It just is an amazing high wildlife value graminoid. And then again, the oak savanna community. So this is much drier. Highlight for me here is this round-headed bush clover. I had seen Midwestern designers post about it, and I thought, oh, I wish that was native here. And then I found it in multiple places in these dry kind of oak savanna fragments. So it is actually native here, and that is down here. It's a really interesting plant. It's very much not deer resistant though, so keep that in mind. You have to kind of sandwich it in between other plants and be careful with it in that regard. The Chelsea Highline has beautiful grasslands here, and you can really see these plant patterns. Here's some gorgeous Culver's root, which is also found at rush oak openings. And then a front yard meadow by Larry Weiner. And an example of a sedge meadow designed by Benjamin Voigt. So what you might do in between trees is really layer these sedges and then add some, shadier woodland plants to successionally bloom. And for a more formal look, this is Kelly D. Norris's design. You want big mounds of plants. You want to really create these patterns. And last but not least, I never thought I would start, getting people interested in these plants, but I have started to grow sand dune plants. This is such an important plant community for our area. We have majorly degraded borders between the Great Lakes and our kind of back dune areas. So, these are for kind of beachfront sandy yards. I've just had someone looking into this from Sodas Point, which is a very low-lying area. They're trying to add these plants to the residences that border the sandy beach. So, the collection here, and I am going to go through these because they're pretty rare. American beach grass, which is the one that's found on this western side of Lake Ontario. The even more rare, amazing beach grass, Lake Champlain, that's only native to this area, is found more in the Eastern Great Lakes sand dunes. But what these grasses do that's so significant is that they kind of have little runners, and as the wind and the sand blows, they're actually catching and creating layers of sand to create a dune or a hill. You can't walk on them, you definitely have to have, walking paths over them with wood. But they kind of make the setting to protect the protect from erosion and also to protect that kind of back dune where we see more trees. And then we have in this layer usually some sand willow and sand cherry, some beech wormwood, and then we start getting into the taller layers. And these are just, a handful of examples, but we see red osier dogwood, silky dogwood, eastern cottonwood, choke cherry, red oak, and red maple in these kind of back dune areas. So really important plant communities, and I'm hopeful that the western side of the Ontario Lake beachfront will start to adapt some of the restoration practices that have been adapted on the Eastern Great Lakes sand dunes. So I leave you with some tools for exploring place. And feel free to take a picture of this. But to find out your EPA ecoregion, here's a link for that. You can download the map. You can also just type in your address and what ecoregion it is to figure that out. We have the New York State Heritage Plant Communities. Love this. It's, kind of an overview of all the plant communities found in New York State. There's an interactive map on their website where you can actually go to your county or area and see all the different rare plant communities in proximity to where you live. I was joking around with Donna before this started. Sadly, the data kind of ends in the 90s. So a lot of times I'm very excited and I'll go to a plant community like a tamarack swamp and then there's no more tamarack. So they have changed quite a bit, but you can usually find representative plant examples there, and it's just really cool to kind of seek them out. As I said earlier, I love using iNaturalist as kind of a real-time interactive device where I'll go somewhere, I've got my GPS on, and I click on Explore, and it will help me, ID what's around me and really start to understand the patterns of plants that I'm using. Bon is the classic, biota of North America where we're seeing, what was here before colonialization by county. New York Flora is excellent for finding plants and when they were actually ID'd by county in your area. They also have a lot of other interesting data, like how general the plant is. Will it grow in conditions that aren't, very, very specific? And then one of my favorites for site visits, and I encourage you to do this, is, type in your address on USGS soil maps. And what you can see is your soil type, yes, but it also gives you associated plant communities. So I know that with my Ontario soil, I'm most likely on a slope, which I am, a glacial slope. And I also know that it was typically kind of beech maple forest. So it gives you the kind of general plant communities that were found or are associated with your soil type. And I want you to know that the plants that I've shown, in particular my plant list, where I'm going out and looking for local plants, are not rare, right? Because we actually see them all over the place. But you won't always find them at the box stores. So here's my local plant seller list. If it's asterisked and you're in ecoregion 83, those are sellers in your ecoregion. But these are all very close. And much better than getting them, say, from the Midwest. So here's some plant sellers. Feel free to take a picture of these. A lot of these are on the CNY plant shopping guide as well. I think most of them. All right, and that is it. I'm sorry if that was too long on such a nice day.